Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xiwan Zhang. I'm the Hub Director for the ARC Research Hub for Energy Efficient Separation. So it's my great honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Benny Freeman. I think I do not need to introduce him because I'm pretty sure a lot of you know him very well as an outstanding researcher and worked in the membrane field for almost 30 years. And Benny is Richard current Sentinel Chair in Engineering at University of Texas at Austin. And he obtained his PhD degree from California, University of California, Berkeley in 1988. And he have already published more than 400 publications and 5 papers. And he won a number of research awards. It demonstrates his achievement in this membrane field. And he also served a number of roles in different organizations, like he served as the president of North American Membrane Society and the chair of the membrane area of the separation division of the American Institute of the Chemical Engineer. A lot of roles, and you must be very busy in the last 30 years. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Benny Freeman to give his talk.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Xiwan, for that very kind introduction. I'd like to also thank everyone for coming out on a cool winter day. And I'm very happy to have the chance to be here with you. And the presentation today will be somewhat different from ones that I would normally give, in the sense that it'll be somewhat broader, and I will try to connect some of the very early developments and separations and the membrane field back to modern day technology in this area. And then beyond that, to discuss a little bit about potential paths forward and new approaches for membranes for advanced separations. The focus in our group is primarily on material science, so there will be a focus on materials research as I go forward. I hope that you'll find it of interest. I thought first to, for those of you who haven't been to Austin, Texas, just to show you a little bit about where we're at. So this is Austin. It's the capital of Texas, and it's located almost in the middle of the state of Texas. At the University of Texas at Austin, we were founded as a land-grant university in the 1800s. We now have close to 500,000 alumni. And by U.S. standards, this is a large institution. We have about 40,000 undergraduates and about 11,000 graduate students. And we generally rank reasonably well. I'm in the chemical engineering department, and my colleagues have helped, and graduates have helped propel us near the top of the rankings in the U.S. in graduate studies. This is a bit of a view of our campus, and our main building, which is where our senior administration sit, is kind of the focal point of the institution. When something big on campus happens, like winning a major sporting event, we light that tower up in the colors of the university. And one thing to note here is this American football stadium. It holds over 110,000 people, and that's not unusual for U.S. universities or major U.S. universities. And you wouldn't come to Texas unless you found a cow somewhere. And so the reason there's a cow on my first slide is that our mascot is the Texas Longhorn. and his name is Bevo. And so you'll find Bevo at all of our sporting events, and it's part of the logo of the informal logo of the institution. Our research group is focused on polymers and polymer-based materials for gas and liquid separations. We have about 17 members right now, and today we are based at a laboratory that is off of our main or downtown campus, but in the next couple of months we're going to be moving into this building. It's a new facility called Engineering Education and Research Center. It has both teaching and research functions. And we will be moving into the north tower of this building on the fourth floor. And so while I'm here, the university is busy upfitting these laboratories for our research activities. And so when you come to visit us, I hope you'll be able to visit us in our new home here in the not too distant future. I wanted to talk just briefly about a couple of initiatives that we have that I believe tie in rather closely with Jiwang's hub. One is the Center for Materials for Water and Energy Systems. This is a U.S. Department of Energy Energy Frontier Research Center. This was awarded just about 10 days ago, actually, while I was in Australia. The announcement of this came out. We will have a 4-year program at about $11 million, and it's a multi-party collaboration between our university, Berkeley, University of California, Santa Barbara, University of Texas at El Paso, and the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And we're focused on very fundamental science related to design of membrane materials for water purification and resource recovery related to water separation. These centers are funded through the Department of Energy's so-called Basic Energy Sciences Division, and so they address very low TRL, so TRL 1 through 3 type research. So having the opportunity to potentially partner with Jiwang for more applied work would be quite helpful. We also have, in the last year or so, an NSF Engineering Research Center, or so-called ERC, and this one is on the Center for Innovative and Strategic Transformation of Alkane Resources, and it is based around the premise that in Texas and in the U.S. now we are awash in light hydrocarbons from the shale gas boom and hydraulic fracturing revolution. And in current refineries, we spend a lot of effort and energy to take large molecules and break them down into smaller molecules like C6s and C8s and so forth for chemicals production. And the shale gas is giving us access to vast amounts of low molecular weight compounds like ethylene, ethane, and propane. And the question or the objective of this center is to understand if one could then take those light hydrocarbons and in a so-called refinery of the future, upgrade them to fuels and chemicals. From a membrane point of view, there are a number of areas of interest. One is gas treatment to remove specific compounds, separating methane from higher hydrocarbons, and then following dehydrogenation, hydrogen separation from hydrocarbons. There will also be olefin paraffin separations that are involved here. And so we're just about 1 year into this center, and it's potentially renewable for an additional 5 years. So we're looking forward to, again, continuing in this area for quite some time. I thought I would try to connect information about separations and membrane separations from antiquity back with applications that are in use today. And the first one to start with is related to the importance of separations that was recognized by Aristotle back before the birth of Christ. And he recognized that salt water, when it turns into vapor, becomes sweet, and the vapor does not form salt water when it condenses again. And this has become a modern technology of evaporation to desalinate seawater. It's been known for many, many years. It turns out, however, that at much lower energy costs, one can desalinate seawater using membranes, and this has become a major industry. And so a modern desalination plant is shown here. The membranes are in these tubes. This is from the Ashkelon desalination plant on the Mediterranean, and it is has 1.5 million square meters of membrane area in it. This is about the same size plant that is being projected to do carbon capture and sequestration from a standard coal-fired power plant. So the use of membranes at very large scale like this is well known. This is the water production, and it gives a fair fraction of Israel's water. They went on up the Mediterranean and later built even larger plants. There's recently been one commissioned that is on the order of 700,000 cubic meters per day. And so this has been a real success in the membrane area and has really given us a great deal of hope that we can further develop this technology going forward. This is a picture of Jean-Antoine Nollet, or the Abbé Nollet. He's French, and he published the first recorded membrane permeability experiment that we know of in the middle of the 18th century. A lot of the very early history of membrane science can be found in the Journal of Membrane Science in volume 100. When this journal was started, it wasn't at all clear that the Journal of Membrane Science would get past volume 2 or 10 or 50, much less 100. And so at the 100th volume, they collected what were regarded as some of the most important articles in the field, translated in many cases and abridged in some cases. But if you're interested in the history of this field, this is a very good place to look. And at this time, membranes were not made out of advanced polymers. They were made out of natural materials. The Jean-Antoine Nollet was using a pigskin bladder, and there are many examples of pigskin bladders being used as membranes throughout the field. And he's doing an experiment where he's trying to study the cause of boiling in liquids. He didn't set out to study permeability, and so this is a lesson for the PhD students in the room, is that sometimes in the course of doing what you're supposed to, you find something else that's really extremely interesting. And so he assumed that this pigskin bladder would be a perfect barrier between the spirits of wine that he put in the inside of this glass container and the water that he put around it to basically act as a seal. And what he found was that after a short period of time, you can see his device here, that this pigskin bladder was distended almost to the point of bursting. And he didn't know why this had happened, but ultimately, through a series of other experiments, concluded that what must have happened is that the water permeated across this pigskin bladder faster than ethanol could. And so the membrane is selective for water over ethanol. There's a driving force for transport, and that caused this bladder to inflate. It's of interest that he also did the control experiment where he put the wine outside and the water inside, and then you see the membrane go the other way. Another key figure in the history of membranes is Sir Thomas Graham. We owe our modern understanding of the mechanism of gas and, in fact, water and ion transport through membranes to his original hypotheses. And Sir Thomas Graham was doing an experiment with natural rubber balloons. So these come out of rubber trees that can be slightly vulcanized. And he had filled one of them partially with methane, and was studying the inflation of this bladder or balloon by putting it in an environment in a bell jar that was filled with carbon dioxide. And what he would observe is that this initially deflated balloon would gradually inflate itself when it was in the CO2 atmosphere. And the conclusion he came to was that this closed bladder was inflated by the insinuation of CO2 from without, and it wasn't understood until this time that one could have transport across the walls of dense polymers. In all polymers today, like this one, CO2 is much more permeable than methane, and that is the basis for the inflation of this balloon. The CO2 can come in, but the methane can't get out. And this has gone on in modern times to now become an enormous business in the purification of natural gas. And so this is showing a 700 million standard cubic feet per day natural gas processing facility in the Gulf of Thailand. And the membranes are in these canisters, and CO2 is being removed from the natural gas to upgrade natural gas. This has been a real development in the field of membranes for large-scale processing, and in particular in cases where space and weight are important, like on offshore platforms and in aircraft, membranes can have a huge advantage over conventional technologies like amine absorption. Another example of membrane permeation properties from the early days of the field comes from John Mitchell's laboratory. He was a medical doctor in Philadelphia and was also experimenting with transport of various gases through natural rubber membranes. The experiment that he describes in this paper would probably not pass our safety inspections today, but he had taken a canister of hydrogen with a natural rubber membrane on top of it and put it in an environment of air, and noticed that the membrane would distend inwards and due to the hydrogen transport out of this container that was faster than air coming into it. And again, he did the experiment in the opposite fashion as well, and saw the membrane go the other way, and noted that this mixture was explosive. It wasn't quite clear how he determined that. The ability of membranes to be very permeable to hydrogen and not very permeable to air gases like nitrogen then became ultimately, more than a century later, the basis of the first large-scale commercial application of gas separation membranes, and that was separating hydrogen from nitrogen in ammonia purge gas lines. And these are showing some early air products, so-called permea membranes that are in these columns. And in virtually every ammonia plant in the world today will have a membrane system on the purge loop to separate or mine hydrogen from mixtures with nitrogen and other light hydrocarbons. Payback period on these is well under a year typically. And I thought I would turn just briefly to describing a bit about how small molecule transport occurs in membranes, and then using that fundamental knowledge, describe some of the potential steps forward that are coming in this space. The basic mechanism by which small molecules are transported through dense membranes comes to us from Sir Thomas Graham. We saw a bit of his work earlier. And it is that if you have a dense or non-porous membrane with a gas mixture at high pressure on one side and low pressure on the other, that this pressure difference sets up a chemical potential difference among the components across the membrane, and that drives the transport of components from high pressure or high chemical potential to low pressure or low chemical potential. And that process occurs as a result of dissolution of the molecules into the upstream or high pressure face of the membrane, then diffusion of the molecules down the partial pressure or chemical potential gradient, and desorption from that downstream face. The rate limiting step in all of the membranes that we use today is this middle one. It's the diffusion of the penetrant or gas down the partial pressure gradient. And in polymeric membranes, the rate limiting step in how gases, for example, diffuse through membranes is the thermally stimulated segmental motions of the polymer dynamics that are ceaselessly opening and closing small gaps or free volume elements in the polymer matrix that allow the gas molecules to execute diffusion steps. And so it is the polymer segmental motion that gates the diffusion of penetrance through these polymers. The flux of gas through the polymer is often written in terms of a permeability coefficient times the driving force, in this case impartial pressure difference, divided by the thickness. And as thinner is the membrane, higher is the flux. And this has driven modern membranes to be on the order of 50 to 100 nanometers thick to get very high flux. The permeability, you can see, is basically the flux properly normalized by thickness and driving force. And within the context of this model, it can be written as a product of two terms. One is the solubility of the gas in the polymer, and the other is the diffusion coefficient of the gas in the polymer. And so the way you can look at this is that the rate at which you can move small molecules through polymers depends upon how many small molecules you dissolve times how fast they migrate. And by changing the polymer backbone structure, one can change either the solubility of a gas or its diffusion coefficient or both, and thereby change the permeation rate. Typically we're also looking for materials to be selective, and that is for the membrane to select one component over another, hydrogen over nitrogen, oxygen over nitrogen, CO2 over methane. And we can then write that selectivity in terms of the ratio of the solubilities of the two gases and the ratio of the diffusion coefficients of the two gases. The material science efforts in this area are often related to changing the polymer backbone structure in order to tune solubility and diffusion interactions to get optimum combinations of permeability, which is throughput, and selectivity, which is related to the purity of the separation. One of the remarkable things about polymers, and essentially virtually all gas separation and most water purification membranes today are based on polymers, is the enormous range of properties you can get by changing the chemical structure of the material. And so this shows the oxygen permeability of a range of polymers at 25 degrees C, just as an example, penetrant. And you can see that the permeability coefficients vary by 10 orders of magnitude, that is by a factor of 10 billion as you go from the least permeable polymers like bone-dry polyvinyl alcohol up to materials that are among the most permeable known, such as poly-1-trimethyl-silyl propyne. There are very few physical properties of materials that vary over such a wide range simply by changing the chemical composition. The standard unit for permeability is the bearer, named after Richard Bearer, who was a famous New Zealander who ultimately went to the United Kingdom and did quite a bit of research there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it is given in units of flux, so this is cc's of gas per square centimeter per second. That's essentially moles of gas per square centimeter per second. Flux times thickness divided by pressure difference. And these particular units put the permeability of many gases in a range that's common. Materials from across the spectrum find use. The gas separation membranes are typically up in this area. Very high barrier food packaging will often involve polyvinyl alcohol as part of a barrier layer in packaging. If you have, for example, a tomato sauce plastic container at home, it will have a barrier layer of PVOH to prevent oxygen ingress. Now, by changing the chemical structure of polymers, we can vary permeability over vast ranges. What we also find is that as we vary the permeability of polymers, we cannot usually independently control selectivity. And so this is showing the hydrogen permeability properties of a variety of polymers plotted against their hydrogen over nitrogen selectivity. This was that ammonia purge gas application. And what's generally found is that materials that have high permeability have low selectivity and vice versa. And this trend was coined by Lloyd Robeson in the early 90s as a so-called upper bound, and Lloyd drew these lines across his data empirically and by eye, And essentially what it recognized was that there are very few materials that are in the upper right-hand corner. And you can imagine that if you could have anything you wanted in a membrane, you would pick one that would be very permeable and also very selective. And that combination is very hard to get. A lot of the material science efforts in this field have focused over the last 30 years on trying to design materials to control transport properties to get better combinations of both permeability and selectivity. And it's, as some of the folks who here in the room who do work in this area, it's a tough order of business. But with that in mind, we'll look just briefly at some potential advances in gas separation membranes. And I thought I would look at it from a point of view of applications and then what one might do to the material science to impact that application. So this is a current commercial application of membranes, so-called onboard inert gas generation systems, or OBEGS systems, on virtually every commercial aircraft and many of any size, and many military aircraft and helicopters have membranes on board today to inert the fuel tank to help prevent explosions. And in this application, bleed air from the aircraft turbines is cooled and filtered before going into a membrane, and that membrane removes some of the oxygen from the air, and that oxygen then gets ventilated through the fuel tank and helps prevent explosions. This is a picture of one of the membrane units in such a device. Turns out for this application, you don't need very high selectivity for oxygen over nitrogen in order to make 90 to 95% nitrogen, that is in a range that can prevent fires. However, you would like to have as much permeability or as much flux as you can get, because then with a material that's a membrane that has twice the flux of an existing one, you can make the system half the size, because you only need half the membrane area. And in applications like this, space and weight are critical, and anything you can do to reduce the space and weight can make a huge impact on cost. And so with that in mind, we have worked with scientists here at CSIRO and also in Korea to explore a family of materials based on polyimides with so-called ortho-position functional groups. The backbone structure, generic structure of these materials are shown here. These materials are very rigid materials, and they have these ortho-position functional groups that, upon heating, undergoes a chemical reaction to produce so-called polybenzoxazole structures in the chain backbone. And these polybenzoxazole structures produced by this so-called thermal rearrangement process have outstanding gas separation properties. An indication of that is shown here for CO2 over methane, but a plot for oxygen nitrogen would look similar. And it shows that these materials, the ones that are numbered 1 through 19 or so, are members of this family of materials, all have combinations of permeability and selectivity that are outside or above that original upper bound. And what we find with these materials is they tend to be very permeable and have moderate selectivity. And as a result of that, they're being considered or being scaled up for use in this OBEGS application, because at similar selectivities, they can be at least an order of magnitude more permeable than existing membranes, and that makes those membrane systems much smaller and much lighter. Working with scientists here at CSIRO, we have endeavored to understand the molecular basis for some of these properties, and this is showing results from positron annihilation lifetime spectroscopy, results that show the free volume or cavity size distribution that gas molecules would see in such a material. Before it undergoes the thermal rearrangement process, this cavity size distribution is very broad and has relatively low values of cavities volume or free volume. As this thermal process goes about at 350, 400, and then 450 degrees C, As the polymer chains rearrange and the carbon dioxide from that reaction is released, it actually opens the structure of the polymer chains at a molecular level. And so you move this distribution to the right. The more open space you have in the polymer structure, the faster gas permeation can occur. And at the same time, it narrows the cavity size distribution, and that contributes to maintaining high selectivity while the permeability is increasing. Again, that's a combination that's not easy to do necessarily. At even higher temperatures, you see that distribution in cavity size continue to shift upwards and to sharpen or narrow. And at the very highest temperatures now, you start to actually get close to carbonizing these membranes, and you start to lose free volume. But this is an example of using molecular design to help develop materials that can be very beneficial in that OBIGS application. Another application that has been of great interest in modern times has been carbon capture, or so-called CCS, and particularly focus here for a moment on post-combustion carbon capture with membranes. And the idea is that coal and air are fed to a boiler. Ash comes out of an electrostatic precipitator. There's this desulfurization unit, and then massive amounts of flue gas go up the stack of a typical power plant. And if one could capture CO2 here, then it could be used for applications like enhanced oil recovery or potentially for geological sequestration. The incumbent technology to do this would be things like amine absorption. And membranes offer a number of advantages in that they don't have emissions issues. Amine plants can emit those amines over time, and they need to be extremely permeable to treat low volumes of gas at very, very low driving force or low pressure. Sometime before post-combustion carbon capture became a key focus, we had observed that polymers that had high concentrations of ethylene oxide units had a specific affinity for carbon dioxide that increased the separation and permeation properties of CO2 through these materials. And this is showing a plot of gas solubility as a function of the Leonard-Jones well depth of the gas molecule. You could also use critical temperature or delta H of vaporization. And typically, if there are no specific interactions between a gas molecule and the polymer, you'll see solubility rise very regularly in a line on a plot like this. Same thing would be observed if you plotted this not for a polymer, but for gas solubility in water. There would be a line just perfectly parallel to it. Gas solubility in hexane would also be parallel to that. In these materials that are ethylene oxide-based polymers, we find that CO2 and other acid gases like H2S and polar gases like ammonia sit way off the line where they should be. And this is, we believe, due to specific interactions between the polar ether groups and quadrupolar CO2 to enhance solubility. And that enhancement in solubility can be used to design in enhanced permeability and selectivity together. And so this is I apologize, is a busy slide. It's one that we put together for one of our Department of Energy sponsors. But in studying materials that could separate carbon dioxide from hydrogen for so-called future gen clean coal project more than a decade ago, we discovered classes of these ethylene oxide-based materials and had very high combinations of permeability as well as selectivity. And these materials were then picked up by a company in California, Membrane Technology and Research, and were ultimately scaled to module size and were run in a variety of separation systems over a good period of time, and were ultimately commercialized for things like CO2 removal from hydrogen streams in the hydrogen manufacturing process. I have one more slide about that here, showing the basic molecular structure of those polymers. and then that yielding these very high transport properties, the first commercial applications for CO2 over hydrogen separations. And then it turns out that if you can separate CO2 from hydrogen, it's really easy to separate CO2 from nitrogen, because the nitrogen is a bigger molecule. It's much slower going through the membranes than hydrogen is. And so these turn out to also be good membranes for carbon capture. And this is showing, I'll show you another picture of it here in a moment, is showing a 20-ton per day CO2 capture system. That's 1 megawatt equivalent at the so-called National Carbon Capture Center in Alabama in the United States. This is a little different, a little bit later picture and a blow-up of the system. And at this National Carbon Capture Center, the Department of Energy is comparing different technologies to try and improve the technical readiness level for us should we go this route, but also to try and ultimately evaluate which technologies give the best performance. And one of the calling cards for advantages of membranes is that they have a low footprint for treating a given amount of gas or liquid, and you can really see that here. So this is the entire membrane system that is treating 20 tons per day, so 1 megawatt equivalent of CO2, or recovering 20 tons per day. Next to it is an advanced amine-based system that's also treating, can remove 20 tons per day. And you can see the difference in size and to a certain extent complexity as well. And beside this one is a standard amine absorption system, and this one can only treat half the amount of CO2 as the membrane system. And so one of the advantages of membranes is the size and weight, and this plays into account in aboard aircraft, in offshore gas processing platforms, and ultimately, if we do large-scale CCS, this will be, I think, a major factor, because the size of that capture system is going to be enormous once you go from 1 megawatt equivalent up to 500 or 750 megawatt equivalents, which would be a full-size power plant. And then I'd like to just touch briefly on a couple of membrane materials advances for water purification. One is related to the problem of fouling in porous membranes. And so many municipal water plants nowadays will have porous membranes, ultrafiltration membranes, for example, that are filtering out viruses and bacteria, particles, a whole host of contaminants from water. And the problem is that if you're treating dirty water with membrane filters, then the filters can get dirty. And so there is a lot of effort expended, a lot of energy expended today in trying to keep membranes clean, or once they're dirty, trying to clean them as rapidly and easily as possible. And once the membranes start to get fouled, then at a given transmembrane pressure, you see the flux drop off with time, or if the way you would normally run a municipal water purification system is at constant flux, you see the amount of pressure difference you have to put across the membrane to maintain that flux going up in time. And this has negative impacts on both capital as well as operating costs. There are a number of approaches to reduce fouling. A lot of them are fluid dynamics based, so operating the membranes where you have increased shear to help remove the foulants. Air sparging and backwashing are in common use to help lift and remove foulants via hydrodynamic processes. When these processes are no longer effective, chemical cleaning is used, and there are several stages of severity of that chemical cleaning. The more severe cleaning methodologies actually damage the membrane, and this is one of the key ways that membranes ultimately have to be replaced in these applications, is that they're damaged over many cycles of fouling and cleaning. And there's been a lot of effort in the literature and to modify membrane surfaces to make them more fouling resistant, and many different approaches to this. There's still a lot that is unknown at a fundamental level. This is one of the focus areas of our Department of Energy Center, is to better understand the hydration barrier at the surface of membranes in order to design more effective fouling strategies. However, it is widely believed in the field that one way to reduce fouling, particularly to hydrophobic foulants, is to increase the hydrophilicity of membrane surfaces. That's one of the design rules that is widely practiced. And along these lines, we have worked with a compound called polydopamine to surface modify membranes. And work in this area was first published by Phil Messersmith, really looking at a very different problem. That is how marine organisms like this mussel can adhere so well to many surfaces, including non-native surfaces like this sheet of Teflon. So this is a mussel hanging upside down from a sheet of Teflon. This mussel adhesive plaque, or so-called bioglue, is the secretion from the mussel that allows it to hang on to, in this case, this piece of plastic or the side of ship hulls, and reduce the energy efficiency of ships going through the water. And Messersmith and colleagues found that the mussel adhesive plaque was rich in catechols and primary amines, and these were on the amino acids that were expensive for the organism to produce. And they reasoned that these compounds or structural features might be important in how this bioglue or mussel adhesive plaque worked. They used the dopamine molecule as a surrogate or a representative of these types of functional groups, and found that when this compound was oxidized to form a compound in the literature known as polydopamine, that it would adhere to virtually any surface it stuck to, and this would include steel, plastic, ceramics, semiconductors, and so forth. It would coat those structures out of aqueous solution in nanometer layer thicknesses, and it rendered the surfaces hydrophilic, and this is the piece that caught our attention in terms of a fouling resistant coating. And so it turns out that you can take dopamine in a dilute aqueous solution at slightly alkaline pH in the presence of air, and it will spontaneously form a substance in the literature known as polydopamine and deposit onto membrane surface. We have made a lot of efforts to analyze the structure of polydopamine and have published a couple of papers on that structure. It is still very much a controversial topic in the literature. The exact chemical structure of this material is not known. It is strongly or closely related to other melanin-type chemistries that, for example, give the color to skin and hair, and those chemical processes are also not well understood. But after short amounts of time, one can deposit this polydopamine onto virtually any membrane out of aqueous solution and form a hydrophilic coating. That turns out to be very beneficial for fouling reduction. You can see the increase in hydrophilicity based on these simple contact angle experiments. This is varying the initial dopamine concentration in the aqueous solution used to apply this coating. And after just very low levels of this compound, you see large drops in contact angle towards the system being hydrophilic, and eventually very little change after that. And so you get a lot of increase in hydrophilicity at very low concentration and contact time with dopamine. This is important because you can also study the effective thickness of this coating on the surface of membranes and the water permeability or water permeance through the membrane. And as you increase the extent of coating, the membrane water flux drops, and that is not that's not a property that you want. And so we tend to do the coating or application of this material over here in this corner, where very low levels of coating give large reductions in contact angle, large increases in hydrophilicity, but minimal reductions in flux so that you maintain as much of the membrane performance as possible. We have been studying the use of these kinds of membranes for flowback water purification. And so when oil and gas wells are hydraulically fractured, one pumps a lot of water underground, and about 20 to 30% of that water comes back. You can use well over 1 million gallons of water per well, and you get 20 to 30% of that back in the first few days of production, and that water is dirty. It has the fracking chemicals in it, it has oil and gas, it has, in many cases, high concentrations of salt. It can, in fact, be reused in hydraulic fracturing if you remove the particulate matter, like the oil, the emulsified oil, and other particles. And so we've been studying the use of these modified membranes to improve the fouling resistance to this very dirty water. And what's being shown here are a couple of experiments, one run at a constant permeate flux of 40 liters per square meter per hour, and one at somewhat higher values. And what you can see is that as time goes on, the membrane that is not modified shows a large increase in transmembrane pressure to keep this permeate flux constant. That is, the membrane is fouling in the presence of an oil-water emulsion. The polydopamine modified membrane is not, both at the lower and the higher flux. And this led to the development of mobile frac water purification units. There's a variety, I won't belabor all of the treatment technologies that are on board here, but there's a variety of treatment technologies, including dopamine treated membranes. And these units now can be they're mobile, so they can be moved from one well site to another as the treatment conditions need. And so this is showing results of a pilot test for flowback water purification up in the Barnett Shale region. This is about 200 miles north of Austin in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. And so we compared the performance of an unmodified and polydopamine modified ultrafiltration membrane in the fouling performance. We also had reverse osmosis on this material after the UF stage to remove salt. I won't talk about those results today due to lack of time, but basically once the ultrafiltration membranes had removed all of the oil and particulates, the RO membrane essentially didn't foul over the duration of these pilot tests. And so what we observed is that the unmodified membranes showed a permeance that decreased with time. And then there are hot water cleans, or so-called CIP cleaning steps, that are aimed at increasing the flux once the membranes had gotten very dirty. And so you see this typical trend where the flux or permeance goes down, and you recover some of it in cleaning, it goes down again, but the overall trend is downward. In the coated membranes, we see, again, a downward trend, but there's more recovery. And at the end of this short test, the membranes are operating more or less stably. And if you compare the permeance of the unmodified to the modified membrane, by the end of just a couple days of testing, the modified membranes are having twice the flow through them for a given pressure drop. And so that means you need half the membranes to treat the same amount of water, or you get twice as much water out of a given size membrane. And so these continue to be used in this application today. The last topic that I'd like to talk about is based upon some joint work that was initiated here at Monash University related to membranes for resource recovery. And worldwide, we are seeing an increasing demand for lithium, for electric batteries and all sorts of electric energy storage applications. And although we have plenty of lithium in the world, our ability to mine it and extract it is being exceeded by the demand is going faster than we can keep up with it right now. And so people have been looking for other sources of lithium, and it turns out that in certain parts of the world, including Central Texas, but in other areas as well, water that is associated with oil and gas wells is often rich in lithium. And so this shows wells that have been mapped in the oil and gas wells in the Eagle Ford Shale area, not too far from Austin. And the average produced water content, that is the content of lithium in the water that comes up with the oil and gas that's produced, is on the order of 1.2 grams per liter. And so there are a number of applications and companies that are looking to see if this could be a new source of lithium. Another application where one would like to do specific ion separation would be, for example, fluoride removal from groundwater. In many parts of the world, the water in the ground is contaminated with fluoride, and once it goes to above certain concentrations, it is a real human health risk. The problem with existing membranes, like desalination membranes, is they may remove ions, but they remove most all the ions. They're not selective, for example, for lithium over sodium or fluoride over chloride. They show very low selectivity between ions of the same valence. And having those monovalent selective separation strategies would be very helpful for applications like this. Another one would be nitrate removal from agricultural runoff to permit eutrophication, so-called algae blooms. And our colleagues here at Monash University have been studying for some time so-called metal organic frameworks. I won't spend a lot of time going over the structure because I have heard so much about them from the groups here. They have the ability of forming very open structures with large cavities and narrow windows. And so one can, by changing the chemistry, tune the pore size and the functionality. And they have pores that are sub 1 nanometer, and this is what you need if you're going to separate out ions or small molecules that are very close in size. They can be unstable in water, some of them, and can be difficult to process because they're powders. We're looking together with researchers at CSIRO and Monash about using so-called mixed matrix membranes, that is, optimizing the metal organic framework and then using a polymer as a scaffold to present that material to a feed stream in a membrane. And what's been discovered recently is that there are certain classes of these metal organic frameworks that have just the right cavity size and interactions with ions that they actually will separate monovalent ions. And the permeation order around this family of monovalent ions is lithium over sodium over potassium over rubidium. The selectivity ratios that we see are the highest that have been reported in the literature for these particular ions. And what's really remarkable about these separation properties is that the ion that has the smallest dehydrated diameter comes through first, and that would be the lithium in this case. Now, historically, in all membranes that are used for water purification, like desalination membranes, the ions do not want to go through those polymers without their waters of hydration. And so then, in standard desalination membranes, the selectivity order is reversed. The membranes that have the most waters of hydration, like lithium, are the slowest. And so we see here also we believe the first time, an ordering in the permeation where the ions appear to have to be dehydrating to go through the MOF channel. And this is of interest because this is the way nature runs ion channels in your body, so that the sodium and potassium can be differentiated by a factor of 10,000 in ion channels in your body. And there, the ions do dehydrate before they go through a narrow selectivity filter that's exactly the right size and has the right interactions for the ion of interest. And so this has been of great interest to us. Those are for cation selected materials. Other families of MOFs, these so-called UAO66 MOF materials, are actually selective for anions, and one can pull out fluoride from a variety of other monovalent anions with remarkable precision. And our goal in this is the last topic I'll talk about. It's also the one that's newest, and we're hoping to be able to create mixed matrix membranes based on polymers embedded with advanced metal organic framework materials to do fast and efficient ion separation. And so the material science, going from polymers to MOFs and other families of material, are giving us new opportunities in membrane separations. Finally, I have a personal conclusion, and that is I'm just fascinated by the history in this field and to see how important membranes have been and how their properties were recognized hundreds of years ago and have emerged to be widely used today. One of the calling cards of membranes is that they're a low-energy separation technology. You don't require a phase change in order to bring about separation, and this is often where they have a real advantage over thermal technology like thermal desalination. And we believe that advanced polymers and hopefully nanomaterial design is going to enable next-generation membranes with much better properties than the ones we have today. And with that, I'll end the presentation. Be happy to take any questions. Just want to thank you again for your patience and for coming out today.
Thanks, Benny, for you to share your perspective on membrane technology. We have a time maybe a few questions. Yeah. George. Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. Really enjoyed it. Just a question about the last part when you're talking about the water being stripped off the ions as they go through. Is there a particular mechanism that you're working on, or is it just that the force is so great that it shears the water off? Or I'm just interested compared to the other membranes that you mentioned.
Yeah, there's I think the mechanism is still under study for how that happens, and I believe there's computational effort underway here at Monash to help understand that. We don't understand it completely for these types of materials today. What we do know from the biological systems is that there have to be a combination of the right pore size, and at the same time there have to be interactions engineered into that pore that will allow an ion to lose its waters of hydration without an enormous free energy penalty. And so nature has done this by positioning carboxylic acid groups at just the right position and spacing so that, for example, a dehydrated potassium ion fits in that channel and has almost the same interactions as it would be if it were surrounded by its waters of hydration. The sodium can't fit in that channel, can't enjoy the same level of interactions, and so it doesn't dehydrate and it doesn't go into the channel. Now, whether that will turn out to be a similar mechanism to what we see in the MOFs ultimately, I don't know, but that would be the first hypothesis, is it's a combination of the pore size but also interactions that make that dehydration energetically accessible.
I'm just curious what your opinions are about the best methods for real-time imaging of the separation process.
Yeah, this is a good point. We don't do a lot of that kind of work today in membranes, and one of the things that we're doing through this DOE Center is partnering with people at the at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs to bring advanced time-resolved X-ray and neutron techniques to bear to study the interface structure, but also to study the transport of small molecules through polymers. So I would love to know, for example, be able to image what happens to an ion as it approaches for example, a membrane surface or a foulant. How does its hydration change, and as it crosses the barrier through the interface into the membrane, because this has a bearing not only on its ability to partition into those membranes, but then ultimately what the size is of the diffusing species. And we're hoping that we can use some recently developed techniques in scattering at LBNL to help us answer some of these questions. But it's very early days.
I want to know what is the driving force for dehydration of these ions?
Yeah, so there, in that experiment, there is an electrical bias that is driving the ions towards the membrane. And then the part that you've asked, I think, the critical question, the part that we're still trying to understand is how the ions can lose their water or enough of their water so that they can fit through channels that the hydrated ions wouldn't normally fit through. And I think my belief is that it will be both a size issue but also an interaction issue, because otherwise the ions will not lose that water of hydration without having some equivalent free energy pathway to follow. Yes?
One of the gases you have left over in LNG plants, which is quite a problem, is benzene. And
Yep.
generally they can strip that off with other gases, but is there any research or potential to selectively then remove the benzene, leaving the less hazardous materials?
Yeah, there are two approaches to that. There have been membrane developments to remove heavy hydrocarbons from natural gas, so things like C3, C4, C5s, and I believe benzene would be part of that, while leaving the methane behind. Those membranes operate based on the high solubility of those heavy components relative to the light components. So that would be one approach. The materials that I presented on the thermal rearranged materials that are being looked at for the aircraft application, we also have tested those for natural gas separation, and in that case, they sieve the molecules very strictly based on size. And when we do experiments where we are co-permeating CO2 and methane and then injecting a model hydrocarbon contaminant like toluene, we can reject the toluene with great efficacy. And so you can have, depending on the membrane that you choose, ones that would remove the benzene and leave the methane behind, or ones that would let the methane through and leave the benzene behind. And then it's a question of process economics as to which would be preferred.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm interested in the polyamide coating to improve the membrane quality.
Yeah.
Because the polyamide have very good attachment to many things. So what's the mechanism of the improve the membrane quality instead of attach the other particles or contaminants?
Yeah. It turns out that a lot of contaminants are either hydrophobic or have hydrophobic regions on them, and we make membranes like ultrafiltration membranes for water purification are always made from hydrophobic polymers so that the membranes will be stable in water. They won't swell or dissolve. And so when a hydrophobic oil droplet, for example, which is thermodynamically uncomfortable in water, gets anywhere near a hydrophobic surface, there's a large free energy benefit to depositing on that surface and minimizing the contact with water. And what we believe is happening is that the polydopamine is essentially acting to enhance the hydration barrier, that is the water that is attracted just next to the surface of the membrane, and then that provides a barrier for these hydrophobic foulants to get to the membrane surface.
Ask one more slightly oblique question about
Yeah.
polydopamine. I remember that paper in 2007. What is it about polydopamine? This is not really membranes, but what is it about polydopamine with that structure that makes it so adhesive to even to Teflon, to polyethylene? I mean, it's got some interesting groups on it, but what is it that makes it so adhesive?
It's unknown. It is an open question in the literature today that there's, what you'll find is, people, waving the hands around and arguing that it has a lot of functionality and that there's potential for a large number of secondary interactions and a variety of secondary interactions. And that's the explanation that's typically given in the literature, but it is not a solved problem. And AFM studies show that it will adhere to many substances with near covalent forces. And so that suggests that if it's secondary interactions, there must be a lot of them. It turns out that it's this sort of chemistry is not limited to polydopamine. Many catechols will undergo the same type of redox chemistry. And so, we have coated membranes like with hydroquinone and catechol, and they're also fouling resistant, not as fouling resistant as polydopamine, but that also improves the fouling resistance. So there's a platform of materials that can undergo these kinds of transitions. The chemistry of melanin, which is a related molecule, has been studied for well over a century, and there's still you go to the chemistry text about the structure of melanin, and it just draws an arrow, and as melanin. There are many pathways and a large number of products, it looks like. Plus, these compounds become essentially insoluble in any solvents when you make compounds like polydopamine, and it then robs you of techniques like solution NMR that we would use to really nail the chemical structure of the material. But yeah, I'd love to know the structure and the mechanism by which those adhesive forces come about.
So different types of forces somehow synergistically work together or something, because individually they may not be so powerful.
Yes, and it doesn't appear to be covalent binding, because this is, it's redox chemistry, and so if you expose those membranes to a strong oxidizing agent like aqueous bleach, low concentrations, you strip it off the surface.
I think we can discuss it when we have the afternoon tea outside. On behalf of the staff, I would like to send our small gift to Benny. This actually is designed have our hub logo on the side. Also inside have the hollow fiber polymeric membrane.
Lovely. All right, thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Wow.
Please join me. Thanks, Benny, again for his great talk.
Thank you.